Ministry is one of the most rewarding callings a person can answer, but it can also be one of the most painful. Whether you've been forced out of a church, burned out in silence, spiritually wounded by those you trusted, or you're simply trying to make sense of the hurt, you are not alone. Welcome to Wounded Leadership, Stories from the Wounded, a podcast where pastors, church leaders, and ministry families come together to share their stories with honesty, vulnerability, and hope. Your host, Dr. Matthew Tanner, sits down with real leaders who have walked through the fire and found their way to the healing process on the other side. We believe that your story matters. We believe that healing is possible, and we believe that helping those who have been wounded in ministry find healing isn't just a mission, it's a calling. So, grab that cup of coffee, pull up a chair, and let this conversation meet you right where you are.
Welcome to Wounded Leadership, Stories from the Wounded podcast. I'm your host, as always, Dr. Matthew Tanner, and I have with me a new friend, Daniel Whitehead. We met, I think, briefly 2 years ago. It kind of been passing in LA at the Common Table Collaborative, and then again in Houston, and got to know each other, discussed our ministries a little bit, and from there came this invite. Because I believe, Daniel, our listeners need to hear your story. So that's why you're here. So Daniel, help me out, brother. Introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. So good to be with you. Yeah, so firstly, I should tell you, I'm married to the husband of one wife. You'll be pleased to know. Her name is Annie, and we have two children, a 13-year-old girl, 10-year-old boy.
Excellent.
Originally, I'm from the UK, as you may be able to discern from my accent.
It slightly comes through, just a little.
Yes, but I'm not Australian, though. I have to always be telling people.
How often do you get accused of that?
Daily. Everyone thinks I'm Australian. I'm not Australian. I'm English.
There's a big difference.
There is just a few thousand kilometers.
Exactly.
But I now live in Canada, to keep things really confusing. So, which is always funny when I go to the US, which is quite often, people will say to me, "Where are you from?" And I'll say, "Vancouver, Canada." And they'll go, "Oh, that's right. I can tell from your accent."
You're like,
yeah,
okay,
yeah. But anyway, I'm now I now live in Vancouver, Canada. Have done for 11 years.
Excellent.
And actually, my own leadership journey, as you'll find out, is kind of what led me to move to another country.
Awesome. So yeah, start from the beginning of your leadership journey. Obviously, this is Wounded Leadership, Stories from the Wounded. So you have one of those stories. So start us back at the beginning.
Yeah. So, I mean, to really précise my very early experiences, I grew up in a Christian home on the south coast of England in West Sussex, and I moved to Hampshire as a small child, which is just on the south coast near Portsmouth, Southampton, Brighton. That whole area is where I'm from. I actually came to lead a church in a very unlikely set of circumstances. In my undergrad, I did multimedia journalism. I wanted to be a filmmaker, and I dabbled a little bit, did some short films. I had some success, and I helped other people with film projects. But then I did some voluntary work in South Africa. I moved to Cape Town for like 6 months, and it was a very formative time there.
Sure.
And I came back with a sense for the first time in my life, like, maybe I should lead a church. Maybe that's what I'm being called to do. I came back as a 22-year-old and very quickly got called into youth ministry in the church that I'd been attending. So I came back from South Africa after my undergrad, kind of not with a clear sense of what I should do, which is the kind of sense of this, maybe I should lead a church. And so I became the youth pastor. And the long story short is, a year later, or a year and a half, approximately a year and a half later, being mentored by a good friend of mine who was the senior pastor of the church. I remember I got married on April the 8th, 2006. On May the 8th, 2006, my mentor, leader, and best friend at the time was diagnosed with cancer. And on June the 8th, a month later, he died.
Wow. It
was a very, very fast and obviously traumatizing experience, which I've only since then been able to really process and understand
Sure.
better. I went from being a youth pastor with a very strong established leader who was kind of helping me to grow into a role that I would one day do when I'm like in my 30s or something. And then suddenly I was a 23-year-old man, just married 2 months, and I'm standing as a youth pastor going, what do I do? And then what gets really interesting is the church elders in their discernment process came back to me a few months later and said, we feel like God's called you to lead the church. So I was just, when I was kind of set in as the pastor, the fifth pastor of that church, I was 24 years old, been married 6 months, and it was a well-established congregation.
Sure.
The average age was probably people in their 40s, 50s. It was, it wasn't a new thing. It wasn't a plant. So suddenly I was thrown into that.
And everybody's looking to you. Okay, now you're our leader. And I'm sure as a congregation, they're grieving. They're processing the trauma of losing the pastor. And so they all look to you like, okay, you're the guy.
Yes. Yes. And I think there's something that youthful exuberance can kind of mask or help people through, right? And the one thing I would say, I think I'm allowed to say this of myself.
Sure.
But I'm aware enough of my own strengths to know that I'm a pretty decent communicator, and I can crack jokes. I can make people laugh. I'm pretty emotionally engaged. So my natural emotional intelligence, I think, is probably higher than most people's, if I'm allowed to say that.
Yeah,
so
sure.
Those are kind of things that I think just natural talents that dispose you to doing quite well on some level in that. Being put on the spot, people ask you questions. I'm pretty good at thinking on my feet and winning people over, even if I don't give a good answer. So I think that masked a lot of the, as you said it, the trauma. It's kind of like, well, there's a new young guy, let's get behind this and let's go. But never really had the chance to process it until much later.
Wow. So you find yourself brand new pastor, the whole congregation looking at you. You're kind of leaning on that leadership, the natural leadership and charisma that you have. How does that trend, how does that keep going? How does that work?
Yeah. Well, rather unsurprisingly, that was not my only traumatic experience in my induction to leading a church.
Sure.
I can think of a few other really significant things, and some of them I won't mention because they involve individuals I don't really feel comfortable talking about them.
Sure,
but I think I found myself in so many situations where you were just really badly let down because of people's actions. So, someone runs off and has an affair or something, and suddenly you're like, oh, okay, and now I've got to somehow help navigate this. So you have those situations, but then you have the small, like it's more like death by 1,000 cuts kind of situations where, a person's reaction to something you say, or people treat you different because you're a leader. Suddenly I had this title, and people treated me differently. It's like people didn't trust me anymore. And I remember thinking, but I'm still the same person. I am.
Yeah, but to you've elevated or you've changed, and so their reaction or the way they related to you has changed now. So would you say you lost kind of a support structure within that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so lost the support structure. The support structure changed, and I again, as a 23-year-old, 24-year-old, how much do you really know? You can only know so much. So you don't really know what a good support structure looks like for me. So
you don't know what you don't know. I mean,
yeah. So you're working all of that stuff out whilst having that pressure, much of which is internal pressure I put on myself. I think I would say what I learned in that season was I grew up in a home, and I didn't know otherwise, right? But I grew up in a home where I always felt like I was enough. I felt loved. I felt like as long as you do your best, can't do any more than that. That's the kind of philosophy I grew up with. But I realized, that's quite rare. A lot of people don't have that. A lot of people grow up with work harder, do more, you better perform. If you don't, you're going to let people down. People grow up with shame. And I realized, well, I'm so grateful that I had a home that wasn't like that. But I'm tempted to say most, I would say the majority of people I was leading had that experience. And that showed up in a range of ways that, again, as a young man, I'm just like, what's going on?
And so it's very foreign to you. You've not seen people react in this way, so it's foreign to you. I don't want to gloss over the fact that at this point you have not had time, or I assume had not had time to even just process the trauma of losing the friend and the mentor.
Yeah. Although I remember a time, Matthew, I'll tell you, I stood up, I was some church meeting. We used to have so many meetings. Some church meeting that I was leading. You know, that's what Amen stands for. A meeting every night. Amen. Every time you hear Amen, meeting every night.
Another meeting is scheduled.
Yeah. But I remember in one of these, I'm not going to say banal, that would be disrespectful, but just in a normal church meeting, standing at the front, and I mentioned Barry, my friend who died, and I just broke down. And this was years later. I just sobbed. And it was probably 5 years worth of tears and pain that came out in a very public setting. And I remember someone in the congregation, when they saw me begin to break, I heard them say, no, because it was like,
that's some support for you. We're just like, oh no, what do we do?
Exactly. And it seems so British, and it is that cultural thing of, and you're right, because in that moment I go, oh, you're uncomfortable with this. You're uncomfortable with me. I'm not saying everyone was, but that person was uncomfortable. Oh no, you can't cry in public. You're the pastor. You're meant to. So there are these.
You've got to keep it together.
You've got to keep it together. That's and those things have shaped me for worse. I found those things, not that the person meant that, but it compounds the pain of like, oh, I'm not performing the way people expect me to. I need to perform differently.
So did that put you on we call it the performance treadmill of I've got to run that race and not be vulnerable and not look to your own needs?
I think it's made me wary in moments of pain about who I trust. And I know myself well enough to know that. Doesn't mean I'm any better at necessarily dealing with it. Other than the fact I can say that to you. So I think in those moments, I do tend to go into myself. And, you know, the other thing I would say is I'm a highly entrepreneurial person. Like there are some environments in the work I do now, which I'll get onto at some point, but in the work I do now where I go, my entrepreneurial talents are really esteemed and valued and of value. And I found in the church setting I was in, it was just harder for me to see the value of what I naturally am as an entrepreneur, as someone who can make things happen, make connections. So to be fair, I remember another meeting, and this is like a confessional, Matthew, because I remember in a leadership meeting someone said, it feels like everything's going at 100 miles an hour. This was their feedback to me. Good feedback. That's very good feedback, and good that they said that. But internally I thought, yeah, but I think we can go a bit faster. I think if we just do this, we can just tune it up and
add a little bit more power to it. Did that turn into really a coping mechanism to keep that speed?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a good distraction. It's a distraction, not a good distraction, but I think it's a distraction. And I want to be careful how I talk about that, because that desire to move forward isn't a bad thing. I remember keep thinking I'm bad. Like it's that shame. Shame is never good. I don't care what anyone says. Shame is guilt. Guilt is a redemptive factor, but shame, you dehumanize yourself when you feel shameful of yourself. You think there's something wrong with you as a human being, as opposed to the things you do being wrong, the guilt. So I felt that shame of there's something wrong with me. And it's because I wasn't in the right seat or the right environment for me to flourish. So I've learned since, and it's not to say, I can truly say this, is not to say I don't still get into the same scrapes of trying to push too hard or do more, but I often think my desire to push and do more is more out of enthusiasm and excitement about the possibilities in the world. Don't get me wrong, it can be a factor that tries to cover up, but I don't think it's a drivenness where I'm trying to earn my love or anything. I believe, it's more just like, guys, this is so exciting. Look at the world. Look at all these opportunities. Let's go grab them. Let's do this.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how I'm wired.
So keep going in your story. I mean, you're this young pastor forced into this role, I don't want to say not designed for it, but at least not trained for it. So how does that keep progressing? How does that go?
Yeah, well, I mean, going forward after a bunch of amazing projects that we probably shouldn't have done, but managed to do as a church, building projects and youth center and various things, kind of came to the end of myself. My wife turned to me one day and said, I cannot remember the last time I saw you smile. And I realized it had been over a year since I felt any emotion. I hadn't smiled, I hadn't laughed, I hadn't cried. I was just numb. And I was numb from managing people and trying to, and I won't go into it, but there were just a few little things with people go, oh, man, this, like when you're working directly or indirectly with someone and you're just like, you are so, like, let's just be honest, you are so messed up. You are so you're so manipulative and you don't,
Yeah.
and you seem to be okay with it, or you're not aware of it. And how do you help someone to learn that about themselves and go, and it's okay? What we need to do is be aware of that and then manage it, not act like everything's fine and I'm perfect and everything's wrong with everyone else. And those kinds of situations, and in a congregation, there are lots of those situations, just become so draining where you're
Sure.
constantly going, I don't know how to do this. So I think it was when my wife said that, it was like a light went on for me. Our daughter was just born, which was like an instant hit of joy. So that kind of connected me with my emotions, but it also allowed me to go, okay, this isn't for me. I have to move on.
Yeah.
And after about a year and a half of trying to do things the best way I could, I moved out on what was initially a temporary extended leave of absence sabbatical. And I moved to Vancouver, Canada to do some study at Regent College, a grad school of theology, just because I'd always wanted to go there. I knew lots of cool people that had been there. I'd heard some of the lecturers and I honestly didn't know what else to do. So my wife gave up her job. I stopped leading a church. We brought our 2-year-old to Vancouver.
Wow.
I became a student and I had no responsibility and I spent a year just studying.
Wow. How was that?
It was remarkable. It was the best year of our lives by far. The juxtaposition of what we'd gone from, the kind of major responsibility, feeling the pressure, to just being like a student and was an incredible gift. So yeah, a very, 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 very grateful for that time. And it was a week before we were flying back to England that I turned to my wife and said, why are we leaving? I don't think we're finished. So we went back to England and really discerned, what do we want to do? And we decided after a few months that we would move back to Canada. I'd enroll and do the MA. Our son was actually born. So when we came back, he was like 2 months old. Our daughter was 3. And we moved back as students, no jobs, enough money to last like 6 months.
Yeah.
Just with a vague sense of God's calling.
And making it work.
And just finding a way. Yeah. And really leaning into my own entrepreneurial abilities, which I had a hunch, but I didn't really understand, didn't really know that I had that. So yeah, that was I look back at it and I'm like, man, I don't know if I could do that again. I don't know if I'd have the faith today to do what I did then, or the stupidity, fine line. Right. But that's what we did.
How did you discover and lean into that gifting? And the reason I ask, when I hear a lot of these stories, when we become wounded in leadership, one of the first things pastoral bent people, they become very introspective, but yet one of the most difficult things for us to do is to just understand and own who we are.
Yeah.
Because it's always been put up there like, this is what pastoral success looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, to that, I would say, and I'm so glad you asked that question, because there's something I wanted to say that I forgot to say. In all of these things, becoming aware of your own trauma and the things that have harmed you, wounded you, you also become acutely aware of how you have wounded others. Not because you meant to, right? But hurt people.
Absolutely.
So if that statement is true, which I know it's true, I'm like, oh, I've done that. And I can think back in my life to moments when I have hurt people and I go, I hate that feeling. So I'm aware enough to be aware of it, to not like the feeling of that. I remember sitting down with someone from that, what I call it, my former life, when I led the church in the UK. And it really is like a distant memory now. But I met with someone and I just had this strong compulsion. I wanted to apologize to them. And so I met with them years, like probably 9-10 years after I'd seen them. And I sat with them and I said, look, I sat with them as a couple and I said, I just wanted to apologize for what happened. And it was interesting because he then said, well, it's interesting because I'd been wanting to apologize to you. And
wow.
And I said, what for? And he said, I just felt like I could have done a better job of caring for you as a young leader. And I felt like I've let you down. And I was able to say to him, I don't feel like you let me down. I really don't. And it was really interesting then, kind of meeting with that person in a very different way. Like, I'm a very different person, kind of been reborn into a new organization, new role, new life, new culture. But I was able to then offer him some words that they were having, some things they were going through. And I was able to offer them some thoughts. And then 2 months later, he said, oh, just let you know, we did the thing you said and we you feel good about the decision. So it was actually a really beautiful gift. But I'm still aware, trauma. We have all been recipients of trauma. And we're all traumatized. Knowing about it, I don't know if that helps me anymore, because I can say, the part of my story now, leading the organization I lead, and I'm like, man, sometimes you have to do what your job spec, your job title says, and that is not going to be good for people in the way I would want it to be. But what do you do? That's kind of what you have to do. So it's very, very
how do you
hard.
navigate that in leadership after, in the healing process? How do you navigate that to where it doesn't become hurting people? You don't, I mean, you have to walk through those things, but you want to do it in a way that's benevolent and healing. So how do you reach out of your leadership tank and not your trauma tank and deal with that correctly?
I think, and at the risk of not answering your question, let me add in
That's
this
fine.
part.
You can go around the question. It's perfectly fine.
I'm happy to come back to it. But when it comes to living authentically in the world as someone who is made in the image of God, I don't think, and I don't know of another way of doing it. For me to be me, I'm convinced I have to be vulnerable. And that is horrible. I don't like the feeling of being vulnerable. I don't like saying I screwed this up or I felt wretched. I remember when I was leading the church, and it's interesting, I've heard about this as a therapeutic technique, which no one taught me at the time. It just was intuitively what I felt I should do. And for a time in my life, I started keeping a journal. I don't write a journal at the moment. I'm not that kind of person, but I did at the time. And I read an entry to a group of leaders in the church, that kind of trusted elders in the church. I read an entry in my journal to them to kind of give them an insight into what was going on inside my head. And I wish I'd kept the journal. I haven't been able to find it, but I would love to be able to kind of go back to that. But I remember I used the word self-loathing. I talked about the levels of self-loathing that I had experienced as a pastor, of genuinely hating myself and, feeling completely lost in that. And after I shared it, awkward pause, I remember the first thing that was said was, "Great, well, thanks for clarifying that. So we're going to find a way for you to move on." And I remember in that moment, I go, well, there's a hurt person hurting a person. there's a response that I go, that's not what I needed to hear in that moment. In fact, nothing would have been better than
but how do you keep from being calloused? Because you're being vulnerable, and to me, it seems like that is a, what's the word? It's a hurtful response. It's not acknowledging your vulnerability. It's like, okay, yeah, that's fine, moving on.
Yeah.
But how do you navigate that?
I think, so this is truly my theory, and I don't mean to sound pious. The thing you and anyone listening to this needs to understand about me is I'm a very normal person. Spend a couple of hours with me, you will quickly see me laughing at the wrong jokes. I am that guy, but by the grace of God. But what I can tell you is, like, honestly, this is not said in a pious way. It's said in an actual, I believe this way. You just have to keep looking at Jesus. So here is God in flesh, hanging on a cross, naked, screaming out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And he gets no answer. He just gets silence. And then he suffocates to death on a cross. So like one of the most horrendous images you can think of. I believe that God allowed that to happen to himself. The Father allowed that to happen to his Son, that supreme act of vulnerability, because it's in that vulnerable act that somehow all things are being reconciled. So if he can do that, then I think we should be willing to go out on a limb every now and again and talk about what's really going on, at the risk of being called stupid, ignorant, naive. I think we should be willing to do that. And we should be willing also to say, I got that wrong. I got that wrong, because we all get things. I mean, we do. We all, and yet, so I think when we live vulnerably, we model vulnerability to others. We give them permission to be vulnerable. We pull off the veil that says some people are really pious and holy and they're somehow separate or different from us. And I'm like, well, giftings are different, but at our core, we're all the same. We all want someone to look at us and say, just say you're loved and you belong, and I'm glad that you're here. We should be able to say that to each other, even in the midst of our struggles, because I think we're all going through the same things. Just some of us don't like talking about it. And
Sure.
That's where the real harm happens, when we don't talk about it.
Well, it's one of the reasons for the podcast is removing the stigma of the story and just saying that, these are real things and I don't need to be afraid of it. I can put it out there and I can learn from, I can be okay with my story. I could even share that with others and heal from it myself and help others heal from it.
Yeah. Yeah. But it doesn't always feel nice, does it? Being vulnerable.
No.
That's what I say to people. I'm like, it's not, I don't know if it ever gets easier. I think it always has the same, but I go to that place of, but I believe, I have faith that this is somehow mysteriously being redemptively used by God to help the body of Christ grow in our understanding that it is truly by grace. It is truly by grace that we're able to do anything.
So many questions. Every time I hear these stories, I'm bombarded with so many questions that I kind of feel like the listeners would ask, or at least I just want to know. A couple of things. Have you seen that vulnerability that you're talking about? You put yourself out there, break down some barriers of change, or brings people through some of their own hurt. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. I think people can test it if they're listening. They can go find sermons of mine online. Don't listen to anything pre 2014. That's garbage.
I've listened to some of the old ones and I'm just like,
yeah,
who listened to that?
So yeah, exactly. But I think I always try to, when I'm invited to speak in places, I always try to bring my vulnerability with me in a way that is hopefully authentic and not inauthentic.
Sure.
So, and I think it's, when I moved to Vancouver, so I was going to get to it. I now lead a nonprofit called Sanctuary Mental Health. We can talk about that more.
Sure.
But what I found in my journey, as the CEO of Sanctuary Mental Health, which again sounds very fancy. I'm like, I'm a normal person. I'm very normal. Ignore the titles. But what I found in my work, I remember, the first time I ever led a church, I was leading a church. First time I preached a sermon, I was just suddenly, it wasn't like I was prepared for these things. So then I found myself leading a nonprofit in Canada. I'd never lived in Canada before. I'd never led a nonprofit. I'd not done fundraising. So this has been the story of my life, just jumping in and working it out with good and bad results. But I remember talking to someone who's become a very good friend of mine, who is a philanthropist, someone who gives money away. And I remember him saying to me very early on, well, first of all, the first meeting I ever had with him, I was Googling him on the way to the meeting to try and find out about him. And I hadn't fully grasped, but when I got there, they said, if you see someone in a high-vis jacket, ask them where to go to get into the big office building. And I saw a high-vis person. They said, who are you here to see? I said his name, and their eyes got really big.
Like,
they're like kind of looking at me like, you're meeting with him? So I thought,
I'm going to have to check the record.
Yeah, absolutely. And I got the bus to the meeting. Do you know what I mean? I didn't have any smart shoes because I didn't own any, right? I didn't have any money for those things. So I went into the meeting. And what I met was just a beautiful human being who saw through all of that stuff. That's what I'd say. I've learned that we are all the same. It doesn't matter what your perception of this person is, or their importance or their significance. But I remember in that meeting, he shared about his life, and it was so sad because his life had been one of essentially being used by people because what they see is the title of philanthropist. And I just said to him, I don't really know anything about you, and I don't know anything about this culture or this city. To me, I'm just seeing, and I said his first name, I'm just seeing, Bob. And his face changed and he said, that's it. I just want to be Bob. And I said, great. So Bob, I'm Dan, you're Bob. Let's keep it that way. And I think what I found from him, and he did say this to me another time, he said, you talk to me differently to other people in this city. And it was the kind of, on a human level, seeing the person, not the kind of schmoozy, let's all, feel good about ourselves and say how amazing we are, but just in this very grounded way. He's like, that speaks to me. And coupled with that, I remember I saw a therapist in my first year of coming in, just trying to work some stuff out.
Sure.
And I remember talking to the therapist and I said to him, the way I've operate is, I said, I'm hearing lots of great sermons in churches. Like, I can't fault them theologically. They're remarkable. But I'm lacking feeling. Where's the feeling? And he kind of said to me, kind of, what moves you, Dan? And I said, I just have to talk about my kids, and I start crying. And I looked up, and this therapist, a tear rolled down his cheek. And which he later apologized for, which was really weird to me. Like, why are you apologizing for feeling? And he said, well, I'm not supposed to do that, right? I'm supposed to make space for you. But he said to me, Daniel, your vulnerability will be a superpower in this city. That was his feedback, because he's like, you'll stand out in a different way from other people. So again, it's like words like that stay with me and go, leaning into my vulnerability. It won't work for everyone. Some people go, oh, I'm too uncomfortable with this. Like,
Right.
oh no, he's going to cry. But others
I think there's different levels of it, though. Vulnerability it can mean slightly different things to different people based on their story, but there's still that vulnerability. How do you encourage because the main listeners are those who have been hurt by the ministry, and they're afraid to be vulnerable because they've been wounded by the church structure that it seems like a wound from the church hurts deeper because they're the ones that have, they've got the book they're supposed to do differently, and they've been hurt by that. And you're telling them, but that vulnerability can be your superpower. How do they cross that bridge?
Well, I suspect in what you're saying, Matthew, always good to clarify before you start a podcast who the podcast is for. Just making a mental note.
Sure.
That's helpful. Makes sense. Of course that makes sense. Of course that's who it's for. What I would say is, inferred in what you're saying is that some people have been vulnerable in spaces that are not safe for them to be vulnerable. And we all know Brené Brown says, vulnerability will be weaponized against you in your life as it was to Jesus, right? So,
sure.
and I can tell you truthfully, in the last 2 years, I've had my vulnerability weaponized against me. It doesn't feel good. Doesn't feel good at all.
Not pleasant.
So I think finding others along the way, maybe someone starts a podcast called Wounded Leadership or something, but finding others along the way that you can kind of check in with and go, I'm not on my own. This is a different way of being. Because I think the danger is if you then suppress that vulnerability, I think that's where the real harm happens. Because you either buy into a lie that maybe it feels like everyone else is bought into, but the wheels will come off that at some point. And
Sure.
I'm not here to point at people, but we've all had enough of leadership scandals, right? If another famous, prominent, godly person comes out as having abused someone or had an affair, it's happened so many times. It just keeps happening, and it will keep happening.
Sure.
As long as leaders don't feel like they can be authentic, because I don't think these leaders maybe I'm naive. I don't think they set out to go, well, I'm gonna trick everyone to think I'm this godly person. Then I'm going to secretly steal the money, run off with the secretary. I'm going to do that. It's part of my plan. But those things happen. And I think they happen. A big part of it is when someone is going through stuff, let's say their mental health isn't doing well, when their inner life doesn't match their outer projection. And then they turn to things to comfort themselves, and money, sex, and power it's like nothing's new under the sun. Those are the things that will get us, on some level. When that happens, so they haven't felt able to be authentic or vulnerable at the point they're feeling it because they have this facade. And then the distance between the outer reality and the inner life just becomes so far apart that one day the wheels come off. And we can turn that into a narrative simplistically that says, well, the devil won. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying the devil didn't win. I'm not saying the devil isn't really happy about leaders doing terrible things and people getting upset. But another way of looking at it is, if that person had been able to be vulnerable at the right point, they could have got the support structures and the help they needed that may just have saved their marriage, or may just have saved their, their morality, whatever that is.
Absolutely.
So I do think, as someone who leads a mental health organization that's focused on equipping the church to support mental health and well-being, I do think mental health is a really important subject for leaders, which to me is really about living vulnerably. It's about living in the story you're in and talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's I'm going to clip this one and use this as the commercial for the podcast, because that's exactly why it exists, is
Mm,
being vulnerable with your story. Share what you feel safe to share, but vulnerable with it enough to sit there and go, you know what? I'm not perfect. I'm not alone. I have hurts.
mm,
And finding that accountability, finding that support, and being able to build off of that.
yeah.
I want to circle back to something you said about the difference between shame and guilt, because I think all this is weaved into this conversation about vulnerability.
Mm,
You said shame dehumanizes,
yeah.
guilt is a godly thing.
Hmm.
How do we? Seems like to me, correct me if I'm wrong, and your great wisdom seems like to me falling one side or the other can be a tightrope. Does
Yeah.
it fall into shame or does it fall into guilt? How do we navigate that as wounded leaders?
Yeah, and some of this, just to be vulnerable and name the thing.
Sure.
I come at this as a British Canadian who lived in South Africa, who's traveled quite a bit around the world. I've been to lots of places and spent
Yeah,
significant time in other cultures. So, you know, I don't want to project my experiences onto people with very different cultural experiences.
sure.
However, without intending to criticize anyone's culture,
Mm,
particularly in their relationship to shame, what I have understood shame to be, and I think most researchers, Brené Brown would be one, would say the same, is that shame is about saying there is something fundamentally wrong with me, whereas
mm,
guilt is about saying there is something wrong. I've done something wrong, and I'm now aware of that. And I think, to me, in the biblical narrative, like in the creation narrative in Genesis, it starts with a good creation.
mm,
And the very good part of that creation is those that are made in God's image, the image
mm,
bearers of God, that is humanity. So I think we start with goodness
mm,
fundamentally. And then we have this shift in Genesis 3 where things go wrong
mm.
and suddenly sin, guilt. Now, the challenge is, and I'm not trying to get into wade into theological territory like I'm some kind of, I can take that on. Like, people have been arguing about this for a very long time.
Sure.
But in my experience of people, when I allow myself to get close to people and I see the kind of pain that people are carrying and I see the responses to that pain, often I'm not giving them a pass, but often the things we do are rooted in an earlier pain. They're just,
Mhm,
and some of these self-soothing techniques we have, which are destructive and awful, but those are the things people have done to survive.
mm,
You look at in Vancouver, we have the downtown east side. In Vancouver, you have the kind of wealthiest postcode in North America next to the most impoverished postcode in North America. They're side by side. Juxtaposition is incredibly jarring, but
yeah.
essentially you have 10,000 people who are addicted to some various substance who live on the downtown east side of Vancouver,
Mm,
because Vancouver is the only city in Canada you can survive a winter outdoors. So that's kind of where you've got to live if you can't find shelter.
wow.
So what you find in that place, I heard Gabor Mate, who's quite a well-known therapist, who's actually from Vancouver. He
Mm,
once said, in his 20 years of working on the downtown east side as a therapist, in his whole 20 years, there was one thread that existed in the stories. I think he said it was either every person or every woman. It
mm,
might be every person that he worked with, is that they'd all been victims of child sexual abuse. Every single person. And if you allow yourself to get close to people that are maybe, let's say, behaving in ways that we would traditionally say is sinful or just certainly destructive, if you allow yourself to get close to the person, what you see is you see the story behind the person, and you
mm,
just respond differently. And what I do is I say, do you know what? There isn't much difference between me and that person, except I grew up in a home where I knew I was loved and enough. And I have a network of friendships around me that if I fell on hard times, they would catch me. I have
mm.
enough people who'd say, Dan, bring your family, stay in my home while you get back on your feet. And those people didn't. That
Sure.
is literally the only difference between me and them. So I think if you can start to see that innate goodness, that humanity, if you can see that
Mm.
someone has been through something, actually what you find is empathy, and you can resist the temptation to tarnish or discard the person rather than naming the painful, awful experience they've been through.
And being able to separate those things.
Being able to separate them, yeah, because
Yeah.
I do think part of the problem, part of the reason we want to other people and turn people into they're the problem, they're the enemy, they're this, um, is because we don't know them. If you were close to them and you knew their life, you wouldn't do that. If that was your son, I don't think you would. If it was my son, I wouldn't. I would do everything I could to understand and support. I think, yeah, certainly in parts of our Western culture, we sometimes hold it too closely together, shame and guilt.
Yeah, and I think you have to be vulnerable to do just exactly what you said, to know and be known.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, it's a risk. It's a huge risk, isn't there? It's a huge risk to truly be known. And it's not like, therefore, tell everyone everything all of the time. It's not.
Sure, we fence it, obviously, but we don't, I think for fear of using it in the wrong place, we throw it all out completely.
Yeah.
But you're saying we're not created that way.
No, I don't think so. I think, the picture I see again and again and again in scripture is God meets people in their vulnerability, that God himself is vulnerable. Vulnerability
Sure.
is good. Like, if it's good enough for him, it should be good enough for us. What's often the challenge is the container. There isn't a container for our vulnerability, which is strange, right? So I would go, well, let's change the container. Let's build a different container.
Yeah.
Like
Build
a podcast.
Great idea. I'll have to think about that. That's a great idea. Tell me, kind of wrap a bow on the healing story. I get asked this question, like, how did you know you were healed? And I usually answer with, I'll let you know when it's healed, but I'm healing. So kind of wrap a bow on like your healing story, and then tell us about Sanctuary Mental Health and what your passion is now and who you are based out of all this that God has built in you.
Well, Matthew, I'm always wary of bows. I'm actually I'm anti-bow. I'm the anti-bow.
Why is that? Why is that? I don't understand why.
Well, actually, do you know what? This is funny. There's a book coming out. There's a coffee table book coming out, which has been created by the team behind the He Gets Us campaign. The Super Bowl He Gets Us thing. I love what they do. Anyway, they did a bunch of interviews on trust. They want to understand trust. And I was one of the people interviewed, and they took one of my quotes. And what they're doing is they're putting a portrait of me and a quote. And I think the book, as I understand it, is just full of pictures and quotes. Sounds really interesting. But the quote they took from me, I'm like, I would have said that a little differently if I had, I was thinking in my head, can I edit it? But then I realized they're reaching Gen Z, and Gen Z hate neat bows. They hate like gloss or veneer. Yeah. Okay. So I'm like, just leave it. But my quote was this, to demonstrate my anti-bonus. My quote was, testimony is dangerous, because when we try and put a neat and tidy bow on our story and say to everyone, everything was bad, now it's great, for people who are listening, whose lives are not like that, they then hold it in. Okay, I can't tell anyone that my life is an absolute mess. I'll just keep pretending it's fine.
Because it doesn't compare. It doesn't measure up, as I do the air quotes.
Yeah. And if your life's got a bow on it now, what about next week or next month, next year? So that isn't, and what I don't mean in the quote to say, I'm getting a chance to qualify my quote. I don't mean to say that people can't share testimonies of God's goodness. Right. We just have to be really careful how we handle them. Because, 100%. When we make it sound like this is my experience and it should be everyone else's, we go, oh, there's something wrong with me. And of course, there are good seasons, there are bad seasons, there are flourishing seasons, languishing seasons, and there always will be. And God's present to all of them all of the time. Well,
I appreciate that, Holy. Before you answer my original question, I receive that chastisement in my illustration, but that does bring up a huge point, that the danger of this that I want to avoid with finding the vulnerability and the comfort and the healing and telling your story is to stay away from the comparison syndrome of because I'm not that. Your story's not supposed to be the same. Pull the principles out, pull the healing out of it. It's not supposed to be the same, but your vulnerability and that part is the same. So I do really appreciate that, and hope the listeners pick up on that you're not listening to these stories to compare. You're listening to these stories to say, look, I can be vulnerable too, and I can also be on a healing journey. So I rescind my way of asking that question.
Wow.
But how are you healing, man?
Yeah.
Where are you at in your life?
I think I'm trying to listen to my body better, which, I've had quite a stressful last 2 years. They've been quite stressful, and I've begun to see that in my body and pick up on that. So I think listening to that and trying to attune to what's going on. I think our bodies are giving us clues all the time.
Mm.
So I learned about 7 or 8 years ago, I realized, if I don't go outside each day, I feel sad. Took me years to realize that. But so it's trying to do the simple things faithfully, right?
Sure.
Drink enough water, sleep enough, go outside, laugh, make sure I'm, checking with my emotions. So
Sure.
I think, and that's the great irony. I think my spiritual well-being is directly tied to my biological, psychological, and social well-being. So
Absolutely.
actually attending to those other parts of myself is my best chance at staying well in a world that is, quite frankly, not for wimps. Like, life is tough. Life is tough.
Absolutely.
If you live it authentically, it's tough.
Yeah, absolutely. And giving yourself permission to take that score and do something about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, my friend, tell us about Sanctuary Mental Health.
Yes. So the last 10 and a half years of my life, I've been leading Sanctuary Mental Health Ministries. This is the second part of my life. And Sanctuary exists as an organization that simply says the church should be the safest place for people's mental health. So we seek to create tools and resources and experiences that help to equip the church to know what its role is and what its role is not when supporting someone's mental health. We have resources like the Sanctuary course or the Sanctuary Youth series, which are kind of like a mental health alpha course that churches can pick up and use, and it integrates theology, psychology, and lived experience to help people find a shared framework, a shared language, and permission to know how to support each other in the challenges of life.
Absolutely. Give me one great, I hate to use the term success story because they all are in their own right, but give us one great mountaintop experience with Sanctuary Mental Health.
Oh, man.
What did God do?
Well, I'm not going to share one, but let me share a couple quickly. Well, it's funny, this journey has taken me from burnt out pastor in the UK who didn't know it to moving to Canada, not knowing anyone, to it's taken me to some remarkable places. When I stop and think about it, just from a kind of Instagram highlight reel, and I don't post things on Instagram anymore because I don't want people to be jealous. And I don't want to contribute to people going like, why is your life so good? Like, it's not, it's really hard.
I
don't believe the lie.
too.
Yes, it's all a struggle, honestly. But I remember being at the Royal Albert Hall in London when the Sanctuary Songs album, which is a collaboration between the Porter's Gate Worship Projects and Sanctuary, and 5,500 people singing these songs informed by people's lament and struggle. Wow. And you've got 5,500 people worshiping God, singing things like, however low we go, Christ goes lower still. Or people singing a song about self-care, like, take it easy, take it easy, take it easy. God already loves you completely. Take it easy and rest in the shade of his wings. I'm like, literally, the work I've given my life to in this moment is shaping 5,500 lives in an iconic music venue to believe a different reality. So to me, that's like a mountaintop experience to go.
Oh, that's beautiful.
If I never do anything else, I've done that. But here's the real one I'd love to share with you.
Sure.
A young lady sent us an email. She had done the Sanctuary course with her small group. And shortly after completing the Sanctuary course, she was actually hospitalized, placed on a psych ward. And after a few days of being there, a nurse came to her and said, hey, I got to ask you, you've had more visitors in the last 3 days than everyone else on the ward combined. Who are these people? They're all different ages and shapes and sizes. Who are they? And she said, that's my church small group. And she sent us an email to say, if it wasn't for the Sanctuary course, I don't think my small group would have known how to show up for me in my moment of need. I know they would have wanted to, but they wouldn't have known how to. So to me, I go, well, again, that's what we're trying to do is to change those experiences. So yeah,
that is absolutely beautiful, brother.
Yeah.
I so excited for what God's doing in Sanctuary Mental Health. I agree 1,000%. As churches, we should be the ones that do the best with mental health. So thank you for what you're doing and let me back up, what the Lord's doing through you. So how do they get a hold of you, man? We'll make sure to put your website in the show notes, but how do they get a hold of you if they want to find out more?
Yeah, well, you can go to our website, which you'll see in the show notes, sanctuarymentalhealth.org, or you can look up Sanctuary Songs on Apple Music, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to music.
Absolutely, brother. Daniel, thank you so much for finding this time, sharing your life, sharing your heart. This has been one of the best. Just those insights. Man, I appreciate you. And look forward to our friendship in the future. And I do want to close by saying, for those that are listening to this podcast, embrace safe vulnerability. Find courage in your story. If you would like to tell your story, go to woundedleadership.com. There's a tab that says tell your story. Just write it out, whatever you feel the Lord calling you to share, and find comfort in that. You can also find some more resources, because like, share, rate, get this podcast out there, because there's others that need to find healing through the telling of their story. Daniel, brother, thank you so much. Look forward to connecting with you soon.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm so appreciative for the chance, and just wanted to say how jealous I am of your beard.
I grew it myself. I did the best I could.
Bless you, brother. Good to see you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
See ya.
Thank you for joining us today for Wounded Leadership, Stories from the Wounded. If today's conversation stirred something in you, whether it brought up your own pain, gave you language for what you've been carrying, or reminded you that someone else understands, we want you to know that this community is here for you. You don't have to navigate this alone. If you are a pastor, a church leader, or ministry family member who has been wounded, or if you know someone who is, I want to encourage you to take the next step. Visit woundedleadership.com, where you'll find resources, biblical counseling, and a community dedicated to one thing: helping those who have been wounded in ministry find healing. And if you have a story of your own, we would love to hear it. Head to woundedleadership.com and click Tell Your Story. Your story could be the lifeline someone else needs to hear. If this podcast has meant something to you, please take a moment to leave us a review, share this episode with someone who needs it, and follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. As Martin Luther once wrote, "This life is not health, but healing, not being, but becoming. The process is not yet finished, but it is going on." That is our prayer for every leader who listens to this podcast, because healing is a journey, not a destination. Keep going. This is Wounded Leadership, Stories from the Wounded.